So this is the second in our review series, our waterway review series. If you haven't seen the first one, it was of the Wey and Godalming Navigations, link in the description below. We also had some really good comments on that video. Someone called Richard corrected Michael's pronunciation of
Purford Marina.
Thanks, Richard.
That'll last for about an hour. And somebody named Mike was kind enough to point out that the Fosdyke navigation is actually the oldest navigation, the oldest navigable navigation. Did a bit of research about it, and it turns out that the Fosdyke or Fosdyke was possibly built in AD 120 by the Romans. That seems to be a common belief. However, there seems to be some debate. Might also have been built by King Henry I, apparently the first documented description of it as a canal. One way or another, it's older than the Wey. So, on to the review. R. Route regulations, licensing, and personnel. The Basingstoke was amazing in a lot of ways.
We really loved it.
Yeah.
It's run by Surrey and Hampshire County Council. I think it's actually 31 miles of navigable navigation. But we only got to do 26, I think, 26 or 27.
Yeah.
Because there was a closure right at the end when we went. There's 29 locks in total. We did 29 locks.
Right, so licensing, it's not the CRT or the EA or anything. Licensing is actually purchased from the Surrey and Hampshire County Councils and the Basingstoke Authority. We got a 2-week license. We paid £60 for it. It was
Good value.
Good value. There is also available a 1-week license and a 1-month license. The 1 week, I would say, is probably a little short because one of the issues with the Basingstoke is you actually have to schedule your movement through the locks, and you can only go through them on specified days during the week.
Because the Basingstoke is off the River Wey, if you have to come down via the Thames, via the River Wey, and so you need a transit license for the River Wey, and I think it's about 4 hours to get from the Thames to the Basingstoke.
About that, yeah.
And it was $7.50 for a one-way transit license.
You can also buy a 2-way license, which I think is actually a little cheaper, and that gives you a return trip. There's a little bit of oddities to the Basingstoke because you do have to schedule your movement on the flights, and the first flight begins literally right after you come off the Wey.
So we booked our license a couple of days before, and we scheduled our ascent up the first lock. And then on that morning at 9 a.m. we were told we'd need to be there, and then the lockkeeper comes and opens the locks and meets you there and gives you your licence, which you stick in the window as normal, and a little booklet. And you can then schedule with him when you do other locks, or you can just phone up.
And they also would be verifying that you had insurance, that you had all of the
boat safety schemes.
Yeah, BSS and everything. The staff were absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Like they were helpful at every level. They were helpful from the moment we called up to do the licensing. Anytime we talked to them on the phone, they were great and just super friendly.
Yeah.
And the lock keepers were lovely and helpful.
The people at the visitor centre were really nice.
Yeah, and a willingness to go above and beyond when we did have a mechanical failure on the way down. So, yeah, just can't say enough for how great everybody was.
And there's people out of hours as well. We didn't need to call, but there is an option to call out of hours.
Yeah.
So E.
Ease of navigation, locks, bridges, water levels, currents. The Basingstoke has a fairly undeserved, or at least somewhat
in our experience,
undeserved reputation for being a difficult navigation. It's because of sort of 2 issues. One is that there are definitely water level issues. It's been a historical problem for years, and they now have a pumping system that puts water up from the Wey back into the Basingstoke.
Yeah, between certain locks.
Yeah, but it still doesn't completely mitigate it. So while we were there, it was no problem.
No.
There was a couple of places in some of the pounds that were a little low when the locks themselves had just been emptied below you and everything. But for the most part, we've never really ran into problems.
But also, since we left the Wey, we heard that there was a couple of short closures because of water levels since. So you
it does happen.
Yeah, and you need to check before you go. I guess. I think it's worse in the summer. So if you want to guarantee that there's not going to be closures, don't go in the summer.
The other issue, the sort of secondary problem with the Basingstoke, is it's got really low bridges. So officially they say that when the water level's high, you cannot have an air draft over 5 feet 10 inches. And our air draft is, on paper, 6 feet.
So I think we were lucky that the water levels weren't too low that there was closures, but they were low enough that we got some extra.
We got through with a little bit of extra room.
We met boats that didn't make it through. We met boats that didn't try. We met a boat that did try and then couldn't get through, so they had to reverse. I think it was about a mile back to the winding hole at Ash Lock, so he obviously wasn't very happy about that. But the night before, we moored up at Ash Lock and I sent Michael down with a tape measure. So he was walking up under the bridge, like measuring at all the various points, and then he got back to our boat and was measuring various points on the boat. So
I was pretty certain we could make it.
Yeah, in all honesty, the nicest part of the canal is beyond the bridges, the low bridges, so it would be worth checking like what your air draft before. And the other thing we did is at Ash Lock there's a water point, so we loaded our water tank as much as possible to give us a bit more room.
If you can take extra ballast, we heard of people, in a temporary case.
We heard of people taking on a couple of extra passengers in their bow just to give them that extra ballast at the front. Another consequence of the low water that we didn't mention is that the flights of locks are scheduled. They're on a timetable. There's the Woodham flight, which is the first flight. That's lock 1 to 6. There's the St John's flight, lock 7 to 11. And they can both be done on the same day or they can be done on separate days. And then there's the Brookwood, which is 3 locks, and the Deep Cut, which is 15 locks.
There's a lot of locks.
And the Brookwood and the Brookwood and the Deep Cut have to be done on the same day.
The schedule sort of goes on alternating days. There's 4 days a week you can do the Woodham and St John's flights in whichever direction you're traveling. And there's 3 days a week you can do the Brookwood and Deep Cut flights. So you've kind of got to make sure you schedule ahead of time.
You don't have to book that far in advance when you want to go through, so you can change your mind. You just need to let them know by 3 p.m. the day before.
Yeah.
If you want to go through the next day. And you need to be like at the first lock at 9 a.m. and the lockkeeper comes along and unlocks the lock. And it's really useful as well because he'll also know like if there's another boat going up, so you can wait for the boats so you can go up together and have help doing the locks. And he'll also tell you which boats are coming down. So if there are boats coming down, he'll tell them to leave the locks set in your favour if they actually listen. Yeah,
and vice versa. So you kind of halfway along suddenly start having an easier go of it.
It seems like a really big pain that it's so like rigidly scheduled, and it is a little bit, but there's also advantages to it as well. And we didn't find it a problem.
The locks themselves are
a little bit temperamental. Like on a few, the doors wouldn't open all the way.
Yeah, there was a couple where the actual mechanism had been taken over by some songbirds. And
some of them, like, we just couldn't get the paddles down again.
Yeah, they just wouldn't go all the way without really briefing and everything. And at the end of the day, part of the water problem is that many of these locks are constantly leaking. Mm-hmm. And so as the locks get closed for the day, there is a whole rigmarole that the lockkeeper has to do, in which he pours sawdust down beneath the lock to actually minimize the amount of water loss. There are a couple swing bridges, a really small one at Mitchett and a large, fairly heavy one.
I couldn't open it. I had to get a passerby to help me push it because it was just so heavy.
And I did it in the other direction, and it's really heavy. One thing we haven't mentioned is all of the stuff that we're talking about, the low water levels, the low bridges, all of these things that make the Basingstoke Sound a little bit daunting, also means that there's very little traffic.
Mm-hmm. Very quiet.
I mean, really beautifully quiet.
And you tend to get to know any boat that's on the waterway.
You see them again and again.
And one last thing I forgot to mention, it's just a standard British Waterways windlass. It's not a different one like it was on the way.
Yeah.
So we mentioned at the beginning that we only did 26 or 27 miles of the 31 or 32, I can't remember, that's navigable, and that's because there was a landslip at
Dogmersfield,
which
had affected it for quite a long time.
Yeah, like since the beginning of the year, I think it's been shut. The last 4 or 5 miles was just completely closed. So we got kind of to this floating barrier and couldn't go any further.
Yeah, and you just had to turn.
Yeah, we want to travel as much as the integrated network as possible. And like on our second waterway, we missed 4 miles. So at some point we're going to have to go back and finish
go up
that
the Basingstoke again. minor point currents, there basically are none.
And what are those big lake things called?
The flashes.
Oh.
There are a number of large flashes. They're
Like just big lake?
They're basically a flooded area, or sort of a fen. Some of them are fairly shallow. They're for the most part non-navigable.
So you just stick to the towpath and it's pretty easy.
Stick to the towpath, no problem. So V, views and scenery.
For most of the canal, it's basically this beautiful green corridor, and it's really nice because it kind of shields you from the towns that you go through.
Not that the towns are horrible. They're actually quite nice. Basically, the entire canal, or most of the canal, is a SSSI, a Site of Special Scientific Interest. Most of Britain's entirety of species of dragonfly and damselfly live in this area. And they actually have
there was a lot of them when we went through.
Yeah, we went through during a time in which they were trying to make more dragonflies and damselflies. There's also some more historical scenery in the form of World War II era pillboxes and dragon's teeth, these anti-tank kind of
boulders.
Barriers. Yeah, they're basically like just really big concrete barriers that have been put into place.
I guess like a lot of the canal had a bit of a rough and ready feel to it, whereas the Wey was very neat and tidy. This was a bit kind of more like, especially around the locks, it was a bit overgrown, and like there's nothing wrong with that. We quite liked it. But.
No, it was wonderful. Okay, interesting points. The Basingstoke was opened in 1794. It was never really a financial success.
Yeah.
It was mainly used for sort of agricultural products and industrial stuff as far as Woking from the Wey.
And like most of the canals, like it was superseded very quickly by the railway, but it just seems like the Basingstoke was affected more than...
Yeah, I mean, there's actually sort of a story about how the Basingstoke, the trade boats on the Basingstoke actually carried the iron that was used to kill them. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, there was an attempt by somebody in a boat called the Basingstoke to try and make it all the way up and keep it open as a canal. That boat is actually now at the bottom of one of the flashes, and you can sort of see where there's some trees growing out of it and stuff. It was used by the army in World War I and World War II.
And it runs through Aldershot, so when we were going through, we heard a lot of kind of...
gunfire.
Yeah, which was quite bizarre.
Yeah. All of a sudden you just hear somebody go, "Right boys, fire!" And all of a sudden it's just guns going off. Also, interestingly, there is a fairly large amount of Nepali food available in the area because of the Gurkhas.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, that's where the Gurkhas are stationed. There's a concentration of Nepalese food. And it seemed really strange that there was this concentration. So I looked it up. It turns out that the Gurkhas are stationed in Aldershot.
So why didn't we get Nepalese food?
Because we're crazy.
The Basingstoke Canal doesn't actually go all the way to Basingstoke.
Yeah, kind of a misnomer.
There's a tunnel called the Greywell Tunnel, which collapsed in a long time
1932.
Ago. And now there's a bat colony in there apparently, so it's unlikely that it'll ever get opened up again.
Yeah.
Ease of access to facilities.
So moorings, shops, fuel, etc.
Well, officially you can moor anywhere on the towpath, but unless you go to an official mooring, it's quite a good chance that it will be too shallow. In the booklet that we got, it lists all the official moorings, and we didn't have any problems using those. You can stay at any mooring for a maximum of 72 hours, and then you must move on for at least 1 mile between moorings.
Easy access to towns, facilities, and everything.
They're quite often in the towns as well, which is we had a few nights in right in Woking town centre. We had no problems there at all. It was really good.
It's actually really quite nice.
We got to use the library. It's right by the shopping centre.
They all just feel really safe because the canals are so rarely used that everybody who lives in the area just seems to be totally curious and totally cool with anybody coming up. We had people walking up to us and saying, I'd never seen a boat in motion up the canals. It's so unusual, I guess, to see a boat moving through. But it was just very calm, very safe.
Yeah, someone even posted on Twitter to the Basingstoke Canal account like a picture of our boat, and I just happened to be following them, and I was like, that's us.
Yeah, we've been tweeted. There are no residential moorings on the canal, with the exception of some houseboat-only moorings. You'll see them as you're coming up the Woodham Flight. There's quite a few houseboats in a row that are just sort of sitting off to the side.
So there's a visitor centre at Mitchett, which is really nice. There's a campsite there. There's a cafe there that we developed an ice cream habitat.
Yeah. There's some nice facilities, like a shower that's available and everything.
And they hire out little canoes and pedalos from there as well. So it can be quite interesting navigating that little section, especially on like a Saturday or Sunday afternoon.
It's where they actually administer everything from as well. So there's a small little sort of museum, some displays on the history of the place.
And there's the office there, so we met quite a few of the staff there as well.
Yeah, and in person they were just as friendly as they were on the phone.
As far as we know, there's nowhere you can actually buy diesel on the Basingstoke.
You know, there's no real sort of boat services, except for there are some dry docks that are available for hire, and there are a couple of slipways, but there's not really anywhere that we saw where you could get petrol, diesel, anything like that.
Okay, so that brings us to W, which is water, Wey and waste.
Water was really easy. No problems whatsoever.
No, there was Ash Lock, which was a bit of an interesting place because you have to go in at a 45-degree angle, and we stupidly decided to try and go in stern first when our water tank's at the bow, which was a questionable choice.
It was slightly questionable, yes.
There's also water at... Oh, there's loads of water. Barnbridge, Brookwood, Country Park, Mitchett, Ashlock, a Fox and Hounds, a pub called the Fox and Hounds, but you might have to pay. Barley Mow and Odium Wharf.
Yep. Although Barley Mow and Odium were both past the stoppage.
So there's a pump out there as well.
Yes.
And it was £5, so super cheap, but it was a little bit old and...
Let's just say that
messy.
The probe, once you plugged it in, didn't seal very well. So
we'll just leave it there.
Let's just leave it there and lean on it. Just lean on it.
And there's also a pump out facility at Odium, but again, we couldn't get that far.
Yeah, LSAN points, we didn't need them, so we didn't really pay too much attention. But it turns out there really is just two, and the one you're going to be spending most of the time near once you're through the flights is the one at Mitchett. So there are official rubbish disposal stations at Bridgebarn, Mitchett, and Ashlock. Yeah. There is good recycling available at Mitchett, but nowhere else along the way can you do that. Or just find little local...
Do what we did.
Yeah, do what you did. Find little local recycling, kind of bins that are along the way, and just quickly shove in all of your little plastic bits. So, conclusion.
Yeah, I can't say how much we loved the Basingstoke. I absolutely enjoyed every second of being on the Basingstoke, apart from when we broke down. But then we still laughed through that.
When we had this really quite daunting, if somewhat smallish breakdown, the staff was hugely responsive. They offered to send a ranger along to drive us to the marina if we needed it.
That's just the most amazing service.
Yeah.
Because it took us so long to get those through the flights because we didn't have an engine. The poor lock keeper had to stay on late before he could close the lock.
There wasn't a hint of complaint or anything. It was just this is what happens. They just went out of their way to make it a pleasant experience.
And I kind of want to keep it quiet because, out of a selfish point of view, I want to be one of the few boats that goes there.
Yeah.
But honestly, I can't recommend it highly enough. And if you're looking for if you don't have your own boat and you're looking for a holiday, there is a hire fleet. So consider.
A Galleon Marine, I think it's called. Is the guys that rent them out from Odium Wharf.
Definitely consider the Basingstoke.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're looking for somewhere without locks as well.
Yeah, it's an incredibly long distance without locks.
We loved the Basingstoke.
Loved it. Definitely. If we were giving these things out of 10, I'd say it'd be a 10. Mm-hmm. This wasn't sponsored by the Basingstoke Canal Authority.
Also, if we've missed anything out or got anything wrong, let us know in the comments below, and we'll correct it in the next one, which is the River Thames between Teddington and Reading.
You know, the only thing that could have made the Basingstoke better would have been having the dog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we'd had George on the Basingstoke, it would have been better.
That would have been really
Nine
nice.
and a half out of 10 for not having George.
Yeah.